There's a lot of these people who kind of argue in regards to form and technique and mechanics. There's one side that, they're like creating fear around movement, that you need to be, if you have any asymmetrical shift or any asymmetries, even though we're asymmetric beings, like if you have any of these improper mechanics, don't do anything. And I remember I had a client years ago who someone told him like, hey, I can't work out until I find alignment, basically. And I said, oh, so you're never going to exercise. Right. And, there's that side of things, right? That form, everything needs to be perfect. Load doesn't matter. Intensity doesn't matter. All those different things, you need to move perfectly. Then on the other side, there's all this things that is graded exposure. Your body can adapt to anything. Basically, technique doesn't matter. Form doesn't matter. Getting hurt is all about how you're titrating the exposure to the stimulus. So you can adapt to anything. And again, whether it's a good mechanic or a bad mechanic, extreme knee valgus, extreme spinal flexion, extreme, elevation of your shoulders in a position, things that, on this side, on the form side, that people get like, oh, if you do that, you're going to explode, which that's one thing that's bad. Your body is meant to move how it's meant to move. But on the other side of thing of like, oh, as long as I just slowly introduce this, I can do whatever and form doesn't matter. And I think like the answer with most things, is the answer somewhere in the middle. Right. And a lot of people can't take that nuance and understand that, yes, your body is adaptable and you don't need to be perfect. And a lot of injuries can be managed, a lot of outcomes can be managed, a lot of success can be found, which is how do you apply the principles and how is your programming and how is the individual and how is your graded exposure applied. That is true. That statement can be true. But on the other side of things, putting someone in a relatively better position for an exercise that is beneficial to them can be safer, right? If someone is maximally loading in a deadlift, I probably want to be able to get them into a relatively rigid spinal position.
It's a good idea.
It's a good idea to try to do that. But you're not going
to all of a sudden have somebody do a maximally loaded deadlift. There's going to be the whole titration up to it, right?
Which is, again, that is the principle of the graded exposure, right? So there's a graded exposure of, can this person hip hinge, right? But then if I'm even thinking one from a muscle building stimulus or from a force production stimulus, having a more rigid lever from their trunk will be more beneficial to lift the most amount of load, and will also, from a hypertrophy stimulus, work your legs in a better position than we would want if you're having too much motion at your spine. Your spine may not need to be a perfect, flat, no movement whatsoever, may not need to be that. But, and on the other side of things, there is benefit for your spine to be able to articulate and move and handle some loads and capacity that you shouldn't have to brace maximally to go pick up a pen from the floor, right? Yeah. That's the thing that I teach clients as well. And so again, it's this principles from in between of how do I apply this? And yes, if I want to work a specific tissue or work a specific movement pattern and probably limit some injuries that would probably occur if I just let that person pick up this deadlift, that even if they're prepared for it and graded exposure, but if they're getting all time kinds of, spinal rounding and then extension and then rounding and extension, if they're not prepared for that, that takes a lot to prepare for. And I'm probably going to limit some of their benefits from being able to be braced in the spine. And so I'm kind of getting into the weeds a little bit here, but that's a really good example. And that's something that's talked about a lot of, can your spine move in movement? Should you be rigid? Sometimes it changes the muscle stimulus. So there's also this camp of people that are very, very focused on what muscle am I targeting right now? And so mechanics impact that a lot. How you line up your structures, you can think about using whatever this part of your lat all you want, but how you're also lining up the vectors and things like that also impact how you're working it, things like that. So again, I'm kind of getting into a lot of this too, but on the other side of things, yes, your body can be adaptable and your form does not need to be perfect before you start adding some intensity. So I have some clients on, even now that I struggle with, that they don't want to apply any intensity to their movements because they're so worried about their movement being perfect. And I think there's other issues that come from with that your movement doesn't need to be perfect. Your movement can have some variability. And so how I really describe it more is it's like a spectrum, or it's like a target. And our goal is to target towards this ideal movement pattern, but it's okay if it's not dead centered every single time, right? But you still want to train with that intention of trying to get to the center of the target, right?
Yeah, I think about this. So going back to kind of what you were mentioning there about the spine and the deadlift and rigidity, it's interesting because we'll see people that are like, well, you don't load that deadlift until they can do it perfectly, right? Yeah. Well, there's a couple things that happen here. But before I even get into that, we'll see him do that and be completely like locked into this form has to be perfect.
Yep.
I don't want to load a shitty movement pattern, however we're describing it. And then in the next workout, they'll be bending over to pick up a sandbag or a medicine ball off the floor. What that rounding is happening, right? It's essentially deadlifting that sandbag or deadlift. You're lifting dead weight from the floor. It's a deadlift, just doesn't maybe look like the conventional deadlift with where you've got two hands fixated to a bar with plates that are like 8 3/4, 9 inches off the floor and whatever else. Like it doesn't show up, movement doesn't show up like you or like that in life for you. That is that very fixated position where you're picking up from the same position all the time. So even if I'm very good at the deadlift, but let's say now I'm picking something up that's even a little lower to the ground, I'm doing a deficit deadlift, or I'm doing something where I've got the larger, like you see in a lot of the strongman, they have the big wheels on the end where I'm picking that up from a higher position or whatever. I should be
or I'm picking up a sandbag that's not a perfect position.
Right. That's awkward. I've got to get my hands underneath that. I have to reach around that, which means now oh my God, you have shoulder protraction happening instead of having your lats, locked in. There is some thoracic flexion and maybe thoracic flexing happening in this movement. And my point is like, I think people could probably get this now. Like, look, there's a lot of things happening here, but I'll also say this. And that is like going back to teaching somebody how to keep that rigid spine in a conventional deadlift position. And if you don't load them, they're never going to know how to do that. So sitting there with a dowel rod or a broomstick, right, and going through this position or an unloaded bar, something that's very, very light. We have like aluminum bars out here that weigh like 10 pounds and you throw like 2.5 kilo, technique plates on the end of that thing. It's sitting at the same height. It's the same deadlift and they can kind of do that or they can do it pretty well. But as soon as I put weight on there, what happens? Now they actually get a stimulus, right? They get something fed back to them because of the load that exists and they have to learn how to do it correctly. But if you just spend your entire time going through quote unquote movement, right? And this has to be perfect before I start to load that movement pattern, you're leaving a lot on the table because you're never actually teaching somebody how to engage the things that need to be engaged. You're never sending the muscle building signal. You're never sending the strength building signal, and you're never sending the signals that make them aware of what needs to be better here. And more importantly, you're not giving yourself as the coach the feedback that you need to see when your client actually does that. Again, in the maybe 2 hours a week that they're training with you, so that you can then program for the things into their program that can help them, right, get better at this or know how to coach them when they're online or not with you and in the gym on their own.
There's a technique that I really love to use for someone, especially who's a little bit more novice, but even for someone who just kind of needs to fix a pattern. And this kind of training is called RNT training. So reactive neuromuscular training, right? And this, for someone who doesn't learn, for example, a common thing is like, how do you engage your lats? And you can kind of, like you said, coach them with the PVC and explain to them what their lats do and try to talk their ear off about how to engage their lats, right? And then you could even try to load up that bar and try to teach them how to engage their lats. But they may not be able to find it in that position. What RNT training does is it causes your nervous system to have a response to different forces on the body, different pressures on the body, different things that your nervous system is going to respond to. If you think about like someone's tried to push you over and you kind of naturally push into them, your body's responding to that pressure. So like something that I really love to help teach you mechanics, but also begin to load is if you add, like, for example, in a deadlift, add a band that's pulling the bar forward away from you. And then now you have to respond by pulling that bar into you, and it helps teach you to engage your lats. That's just one example. And it's endless, but there's even some reactive neuromuscular response to load. Right? Something that we hear a lot with clients, especially newer clients, is they almost say sometimes it's almost easier when the weight's heavier.
That just happened to me yesterday with a client.
That just happened to me today.
Kettlebell swing is a great example.
Especially something ballistic like that, where you need to feel, because your body needs to have some sort of load to respond to. Your nervous system needs a response. Yes, the very experienced person can co-contract their body and create tension in space without any response. But learning these things are a really, really great tool to help ramp up the intensity for someone to something that they really are strong enough and can handle, even if their technique is not perfect. And it's a way to add more intensity while also teaching them how to move and how to engage things. And I think in a quote unquote safer way, and a way that's more optimal for producing better outcomes for, more strength, more force coupling, more power, all these different things that are good things to help progress an individual.